So welcome everyone. My name is Catherine Koverola and I'm serving as the director of the Center for African Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. And I am so delighted that you are all here. This is an amazing day of celebration as we have launched our inaugural Celebrate Africa days here at Pitt. And so we have had today an absolutely extraordinary array of workshops, seminars, roundtables, a film screening, and we are so delighted that we have had many members of the African diaspora community join us, including a roundtable session that they hosted and was well attended. And so it's my pleasure to serve as the MC of this event. And tomorrow we will also be having a festival. So I hope that many of you will be able to come and join with your family and friends. And so the first welcome will be by Dr. Ariel Armani, who is the Vice-Chancellor of Global Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. And he's unable to be with us, but he has sent a video greeting. And so we're going to see this now.
Hello friends, colleagues, and esteemed guests. From all of us at the University Center for International Studies and Pitt Global, I'm thrilled to welcome you to Celebrate Africa. I'm excited to address you all today after witnessing the amazing growth and development that the Center for African Studies has seen over the last few years. The Center for African Studies is now a recognized national resource center with foreign language and area studies fellowship funding. This is a wonderful achievement which makes us extremely proud. I'd like to recognize the African Studies team for their hard work putting this event together and running center projects and programs every day. Catherine Koverola, Macrina Lele, Anna Maria Carnes, Reese Schultz, and Corey Winning. You all deserve more than a round of applause. I also wish to applaud all the faculty and students who have helped in coordinating the Celebrate Africa event and the African diaspora community in Pittsburgh. Thank you all so much. Before we get started, let me just say there is so much to celebrate about this incredible continent. The entrepreneurship, academic excellence, vibrant art and cultures, and the opportunities to exchange ideas, innovate, and grow as scholars and global citizens. We celebrate our remarkable Pitt faculty who are engaged across Africa in over 30 countries. They represent the health sciences, social sciences, humanities, and many professional schools. We also celebrate our alumni. So many have won prestigious scholarships, Rhodes, Fulbright, Boren, Critical Language. All serve as global ambassadors for Pitt and change agents for good. I'm delighted that a group of our distinguished alumni serve as panelists in this event. We are thrilled that so many of you are joining us in our mission to educate the next generation of global citizens. Before we start the celebration, I'd like to offer one last round of congratulations to the African Studies Center staff, faculty, students, and alumni for all their amazing accomplishments. Now, it's time for celebration. Thank you very much.
Great. Technology is really great, especially when it works. And it worked today, so we're really glad that we could hear this lovely greeting from Dr. Armani. It's now my pleasure to introduce our Senior Vice-Chancellor and Provost, Dr. Cudd. Dr. Cudd is one of the first people that I got to know at Pitt, She's the one who invited me to join this amazing institution, and I'll always be very, very grateful to her for that. Dr. Cudd is an extraordinary woman. She's a philosopher, and she has written groundbreaking works on feminism and many other topics. She's a very accomplished scholar, author, and academic leader. It's no secret that in these times, being an academic leader takes an extraordinary person with a lot of determination, empathy, and wisdom. And I have had the privilege of working closely with Anne, and I'm always very grateful for her insights and leadership. Since being the provost at the University of Pittsburgh, Dr. Cudd has led efforts on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in a way that has true impact. I won't go into all those details. Many of you who are sitting in these seats are the beneficiaries, and our students ultimately are the beneficiaries of her vision and commitment to having equity in higher education and creating opportunities for students. And she has led that charge and accomplished that through many efforts and initiatives that have really impacted our students. So we should be very proud that Dr. Cudd is our provost. She is also very committed to the University Center for International Studies and to all of us at the Center for African Studies. And I was so delighted to know that she was available this evening. Her schedule is beyond imagination. It's not something that anyone envies. And so we're really grateful to be able to have you here and to give greetings and welcome this amazing group of people here today.
Thank you, Catherine. That's really over the top, but I'm really delighted to be here and so excited to see what you've been doing and to join with you tonight. So proud of what the Center for African Studies has done, and off to such a great start with for the year with a new Title VI grant. Congratulations, it's fantastic. So I'm delighted to be here as we kick off what will be, or is, in the middle of two extremely important days, a time when we celebrate not only the university's scholarship and engagement on the African continent, but with the African diaspora community in the city of Pittsburgh and across the region. Pitt is really an institution that's committed to global studies, and we strongly believe in educating our students for a world that's increasingly interconnected. Pitt prepares students to understand the links between their own lives and those of people around the world. And it's really key that we have a strong focus on Africa. Africa is a massive continent where innovation and entrepreneurship are thriving and where population growth is really exponential. Just consider that by 2050, over 25% of the world's population is expected to be in Africa. And it's fantastic that we're able to showcase the importance of Africa, its importance to the university, to the region, and to the world through this event. Through the work of the Center for African Studies under Catherine Koverola's exceptional leadership, each year the students and faculty can be engaged as scholars and practitioners to further advance our knowledge of Africa. Now, undoubtedly, we will all gain further deep insights into Africa's place on the global stage and our role in continuing to embrace its transformational and historic contributions. It's now my great honor to introduce our county executive, Rich Fitzgerald. The county's top elected official, Rich Fitzgerald, is in his third and final term as the county executive. Widely recognized for his work ethic, Rich is one of the county's biggest champions and is well known for bringing together people and organizations on regional issues. Under his leadership, the county has concentrated on economic development and job creation and boasts high-quality jobs, a diverse and growing economy, a low cost of living, and excellent quality of life. The 2020 census numbers have underscored the success of those efforts. For the first time in 60 years, the county's population grew over the last decade. Just as importantly, the area is becoming more and more diverse. There was substantial growth in the Hispanic and Asian populations in the county, and more people are identifying as multiracial. That increased diversity can also be attributed to multi-year efforts to ensure that this community is more welcoming. That diversity, along with the population growth, will continue to move this region forward. Rich has also managed the county's response to the coronavirus pandemic, working closely with the health department, and has provided consistent and reassuring messaging to county residents since the first case was reported in March of 2020. As a participant in the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine trial, he frequently speaks about his experience in the trial and his confidence in the vaccine and its role in the county's recovery from the virus. So, born and raised in the city of Pittsburgh, Rich graduated from Carnegie Mellon University, which is just fine with us. They're a good neighbor. He and his wife, Kathy, live in Squirrel Hill, and doing their part to grow the population, they have 8 children. So please join me in welcoming Rich Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Dr. Cudd, and thank you for not holding that other school against me that I went to. But I had the good sense of marrying a Pitt alumni, so just... Catherine, congratulations. Congratulations, Doctor, for getting that Title VI grant and for continuing all the great things that this great university continues to do. One of the things, I'm in my 11th year of a 12-year run. I'm not allowed to run again, and that's okay. I'm fine with that. But one of the things, as Dr. Cudd mentioned, I wanted to focus on growing the economy, and mostly that happens by keeping our young people, keeping the people that graduated from this great university wanting to stay here, but not just wanting to stay here, but being able to stay here with great opportunities. Because for so many years, what Pittsburgh was known for was exporting people. I mean, first we exported steel, a century and a half century ago, but then we started exporting our young people, and that wasn't very good. So we're keeping them now, but one of the great reasons we're keeping them now is because of this university. This university has become an economic powerhouse in so many different ways, and she talked about medicine, and one of the reasons I got in the trial was because the University of Pittsburgh was conducting that trial, and I felt confident that when we were dealing with the pandemic 2.5 years ago, and I had never heard the word Moderna before, that we're going to run this trial called Moderna. Do you want to be involved in it? I felt confident because this great university has been doing that for a long, long time, going back to things like the polio vaccine with Dr. Salk, and then transplantation, anti-rejection drugs with Dr. Starzl a generation later. But as Dr. Cudd said, it's the international component and connection that Welcoming Week and the African Studies are all about. And that's what we want to continue to strengthen. We obviously know we live in a global economy, a global marketplace that touches all of us. And for Pittsburgh and for the Pittsburgh region to be able to move ahead and be able to compete, we need everybody's talents, and we need the connections to all of our partners and all of our friends across the globe. And as I look out on this room and see, a lot of people that are younger than me, the one request I make is when you're done with your studies, stay here. You travel once in a while to go over to those other places, but we like you to be here because we want your talents to be part of what Pittsburgh has really become. And as Dr. Cudd mentioned, the growing population that we finally overturned after more than half a century really happened because a lot of people from other parts of the world started to come here and started to stay here. And that's really important to all of us, particularly among the young people, the 25 to 34-year-old cohorts that really have found Pittsburgh such a great place. So over the next couple of days, as you today and obviously tomorrow to interact and to really celebrate the department and what, what the Celebrate Africa event is all about. Really embrace what we are. And I'm going to ask just one question, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but how many of you grew up in Pittsburgh? Very few. Well, thank you that you stayed here. But for the rest of you, welcome. We're glad to have you here. And again, as you spend your studies here and learn more about this great place, we know it's going to grow on you a little bit. And then stay here, and stay here and be part of the contribution and all the great things that this university and this region has really become known for. So thank you for inviting me today. I'm always proud when the university wants to interact with us at the county level and the regional level, and we're going to continue to work on what you do. I also want to my friend Benedict, who works for us in our Department of Human Services, and one of the things our Department of Human Services really is part of is helping people integrate into Pittsburgh and in the Allegheny County community, whether it's through jobs, whether it's through education, whether it's through housing, whether it's through cultural connections and all the things that we do. So Benedict Killing is the person here that you will interact with, and if you have any problems, you just yell at him, and then he can bring them to me and yell at me for all you're doing. So congratulations on what you're doing, and enjoy the couple of days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fitzgerald. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Paul Zeleza. And we were just reminiscing with Dr. Cudd of how Paul and I met. And for those of you who are academics, there's this thing called accreditation when the universities are under the microscope. And I happened to be a dean at another university, and he happened to be a provost at another university, and he had us under a microscope. But he gave us a thumbs up, so we've been friends ever since. Paul is a renowned Pan-African historian and considered a leading authority on African economic history. He has an incredible CV. His higher education began with a BA from the University of Malawi, and it was followed by an MA from the University of London, where he studied African history and international relations. He holds his PhD in economic history from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. Following this, he has had an absolutely stellar academic career. He's published 27 books, over 400 journal articles and book chapters, and keynoted nearly 250 addresses, papers, public lectures at leading universities and international conferences in over 30 countries. The last time I saw Paul, before I met him in Pittsburgh last night, was in Nairobi, where he was serving as the Vice-Chancellor and Professor of Social Sciences and Humanities at the United States International University of Africa in Nairobi. He is currently the Associate Provost and North Star Distinguished Professor at Case Western Reserve University. It is really a privilege for us to have you here, Dr. Paul Zeleza. I know that we're going to have an amazing lecture, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Catherine, for that very kind, generous introduction. I was joking with somebody that I used to live in Pennsylvania. I was actually teaching at Penn State more than 15 years ago. And I never came to this great university. When she called me, I said, of course I'm coming. And I'm really delighted. I've enjoyed the presentations over the last several hours. And I want to thank the Provost for joining us today, and also thank the Chief executive for the county, for his wonderful remarks in support of internationalization. The world is undergoing profound and tumultuous transformations. Africa's participation is likely to be uneven, messy, and unpredictable, but undoubtedly critical. The continent and its peoples have been an integral part of all momentous historical developments ever since the emergence of the modern world system half a millennium ago. Indeed, since the evolution of humanity on our incredibly beautiful but fragile planet, increasingly despoiled and damaged by human activities. However, more often than not, Africa has been, as the late great Kenyan intellectual Ali Mazrui used to put it, a pawn rather than a player. What are the prospects for the continent becoming a key driver rather than a helpless passenger on the locomotive of global dramas and transformations in the 21st century? It is tempting to assume the ineluctability of Africa's history of internal underdevelopment, external dependency, and global marginality. Evidence for such continuities is not hard to find in the voluminous data and indices churned incessantly by international agencies, consultancy firms, and academics on development, democracy, higher education, and even happiness, in which Africa tends to score lower than other world regions. Yet, beneath the invented and imaginary immutability of Africa's fate, sanctified in the calcified and contemptuous narratives of Afro-pessimism, there are other developments, possibilities, and trajectories. Indeed, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, Afro-optimism arose from Africa's purported hopelessness, proclaimed by The Economist magazine in 2000, or the lost decades of the 1980s and 1990s in Africanist discourse, with new hopes for self-determination, democratization, development, the triple dreams of the enduring nationalist project. The Africa Rising narrative briefly captured the imagination of the ubiquitous development industry that is always looking to reinvent the frontiers of capitalist superexploitation. The optimism has faded a little, shattered in part by the COVID-19 pandemic and apparent recessions of democracy and development. Still, the 21st century is only in its infancy, and the future that is endlessly long cannot be foreclosed by the present. As a historian, I'm trained to be wary of crystal gazing, indulging in futuristic fantasies of bliss or fears of blight, or of forthcoming nirvana or damnation. As a scholar, I'm suspicious of both unbridled Afro-pessimism and Afro-optimism. I veer towards Afro-realism that entails candidly acknowledging the structural weight of history on the present, as well as the power of human agency, of contemporary social forces and reconfigurations of power to refashion the future. The past, present, and future are inextricably intertwined by the subterranean material and superstructural ideological forces through which the dialectical dance of history takes place. In this presentation, I'd like to discuss three forces out of several that will affect the place of Africa and African peoples in the 21st century. They include demography, diaspora, and culture. Let me say at the outset that these are exceedingly complex, contradictory, and rapidly changing dynamics that will be conditioned by equally complicated, conflicting, and shifting constellation of global forces. My argument is quite simple. Africa is likely to become an increasingly important player in global affairs. I'll begin by briefly outlining the unfolding changes in the world political economy. Then I'll discuss at greater length these three major transformations. So first of all, global crisis and transformations. Please allow me to preface my remarks by referencing two of my books, one published and another under preparation. In 2021, I published a book titled Africa and the Disruptions of the 21st Century. In one chapter covering what I regard as momentous developments in the 2010s, I identified 6 key trends. At the moment, I'm working on a book tentatively titled The Long Transition to the 21st Century, a Global History of the Present, in which I seek to elaborate on several of these themes. The first trend is what I call the globalization of tribalism, which refers to the spread of ethno-cultural, xenophobic, racist, fundamentalist, and jingoistic nationalisms. Second, democratic recessions manifested in democratic backsliding, polarization, and breakdown in civic discourse, even in the so-called mature democracies, which is accompanied by countervailing resistance by social movements. Third, there is rising economic disequilibrium, evident in slower economic growth in many world regions, deepening inequalities, and significant shifts in the world economy. Fourth, the world is undergoing shifting hierarchies and hegemonies, evident in intensifying international tensions and rivalries that are fueling the specter of decoupling and deglobalization. The economic and political weight of emerging economies has risen. In 2018, middle-income countries accounted for 53.6% of global GDP in terms of purchasing power parity. In PPP terms, China overtook the United States as the world's largest economy in 2014, and by 2018, its GDP stood at $25.3 trillion compared to $20.7 trillion for the United States. Fifth is the emergence of digital capitalism, embedded in the unfolding fourth industrial revolution that is transforming all aspects of economic, social, and political life as digital, biological, and physical systems increasingly converge. Sixth is what I term the rebellion of nature, which refers to the accelerating onslaught of extreme weather events, from hurricanes, tornadoes, cyclones, tsunamis, floods, and blizzards, to droughts, dust storms, and wildfires, to melting ice caps and rising sea levels that threaten the survival of many islands and coastal communities. Scientific consensus, global consciousness, and commitment to sustainable development goals and climate mitigation and adaptation have grown, led by indefatigable environmental movements in which the youth play a major role. Demographic dividend. Since the end of World War II, when the development industry emerged and poverty was discovered as a global problem, amenable to policy interventions, scholars and policymakers have grappled with explaining why some countries are developed and wealthy and others remain underdeveloped and poor. These questions have been addressed differently in the various academic disciplines and from divergent ideological perspectives informed by Marxist and neo-Marxist, neoclassical, neoliberal, feminist, constructivist, post-colonial, and ecological theories. In more popular discourses, there are the various determinisms of geographical location, cultural norms, historical pathways, and ideological predilections. Undoubtedly, geography, culture, history, and ideology affect the processes and patterns of development. But notions that civilization, modernity, or development are a monopoly of selected peoples in Euro-America are intellectually untenable and emanate from odious imperialist, racist, and white supremacist ideologies. More compelling explanatory frameworks of development are those that stress the quality of institutions, social trust, and human capital. Time does not allow for elaboration. Suffice it to say, the quality of human capital refers to the knowledge, skill sets, experiences, and attributes that people possess, which reflects their levels of education and state of health. Since independence, the imperative of building human capital has been widely recognized by African states, international and intergovernmental agencies, and civil society. There are three critical dimensions to consider in relation to the continent's human capital development. First is the demographic explosion that the Provost shared with us from the centuries-long demographic devastations of the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism, both perpetrated by Europe. While demography is not destiny, without population growth, future destinies are compromised. It wasn't until the early 2000s that Africa's share of the world population returned to what it had been in 1750, when the slave trade intensified. Population growth began to accelerate from the 1960s. Africa's share of the world population grew from 9.3% in 1960 to 10.7% in 1980, to 13.2% in 2000 to 17.2% in 2020. In raw numbers, there were about 283 million Africans in 1960, the so-called year of African independence. The population skyrocketed to 811 million in 2000, 1.34 billion in 2020. On current trends, it is projected, again, as the Provost shared with us, to rise to 25.6% in 2050, or 2.5 billion people, and 39.4% in 2100, 4.28 billion people. Thus, whatever the challenges of post-colonial Africa, the continent has been enjoying a historic rate of population growth, which points to improvements in material conditions and more subterranean changes in collective mentalities, moral economies, and cultural ecologies. The youth purge is a demographic phenomenon which occurs when child mortality declines, but the fertility rate remains high, so that a large share of the population is comprised of young people. Currently, about 60% of the African population is below 25 years of age. And by 2100, the continent will still have the world's youngest population with a median age of 35. The relationship between population growth and economic development is a matter of fierce debate. In a world of fixed resources, Malthusian pessimists contend population growth undermines economic growth. But empirical evidence in the 1970s and 1980s showed that incomes in many regions continue to rise despite rapid population growth. The optimists argue that population growth spurs increased competition, knowledge innovation, and technology that fuels development. In contrast to the demographic pessimists and optimists, neutralists maintain there is no significant connection between population and economic growth. The reality is that population growth can become an asset or a brake on development depending on its evolving age structure and quality of human capital. The youth explosion, I believe, gives Africa unprecedented opportunities for development and democracy, so long as the youth are fully mobilized through quality education and smart and targeted investment. Writing on the recent authoritarian slide in West Africa, Germain Boadi states, quote, "Citizens have taken matters into their own hands. Activists, journalists, opposition politicians, ordinary citizens, and even some state officials have forged a kind of resistance movement to demand accountability across the region. The most formidable foot soldiers include the new generation of creative young people who are using a mix of new technology and old-school protest tactics to challenge corrupt officials and agitate for better governance," end of quote. Living in Kenya from 2016 to 2021, I was struck by the irrepressible energies, creativity, and entrepreneurial mindsets of the youth. Second, then, is the question of the policies adopted by governments to build socio-economic systems that can harness the youth purge into a demographic dividend. The term refers to the economic benefit arising from a significant increase in the ratio of working-age adults relative to young and old dependents. In countries with a high proportion of children or the elderly, a high proportion of resources is spent on taking care of these groups, which is likely to depress the pace of economic growth. When the youth purge transitions into working age, it becomes, if it is endowed with good health and education, quality human capital that can generate the demographic dividend of economic growth. However, the demographic dividend is not automatic or inevitable. It is driven by a complex mix of policies and investments through the mechanisms of labor supply, savings, and human capital. As Africa undergoes a demographic transition previously traversed by other regions, it has an opportunity to turn its current population boom into fast economic growth and development along the path of the economies of East Asia. There is now a huge literature and policy documents on the subject that time doesn't allow for further elaboration. Third, building capabilities is imperative, a concept that is well articulated in reports by the United Nations Development Programme, defined as people's freedom to choose what to be and do, which is closely related to the notion of opportunities. Capabilities are critical for human development. The UNDP distinguishes between basic capabilities, such as early childhood survival, primary education, entry-level technology, and resilience to recurrent shocks, and enhanced capabilities, including access to quality health at all levels, high-quality education at all levels, effective access to present-day technologies, and resilience to unknown new shocks. The challenge for Africa is to raise both sets of capabilities and to improve what the UNDP calls the Inequality Adjusted Hdi, which was introduced in 2010. The IHDI discounts the HDI according to the extent of inequality. The data is disaggregated in terms of the Gender Development Index and the Gender Inequality Index, a composite measure of gender inequality using 3 dimensions: reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market. HDI and IHDI rankings vary from conventional GDP per capita rankings. For example, in 2019, the world's largest economies, the United States and China, were ranked 17th and 85th, respectively. Education and employment are key indicators of human development. There has been a remarkable improvement in education. For example, in 1959, there were only 76 universities across Africa, concentrated in South Africa and North Africa. The number increased to 294 in 1979 and exploded to 784 in 2000, and last year there were 1,690 universities. But this accounted for only 8.39% of the world's universities. Primary and secondary enrollments also improved, raising the literacy rate to 65.6%, still the lowest in the world. The UN Economic Commission for Africa estimates that 39 billion in annual financing is needed to improve access to the quality of education. Also in need of massive investments and improvement is employment. According to data from the International Labour Organization, the Sub-Saharan Africa region suffers from high rates of unemployment, labor underutilization, decent work deficits that are especially prevalent in the informal economy, the largest source of employment, and extreme rates of working poverty. However, the narrative of Africa's unemployment crisis has been challenged. According to Louise Fox, from the Brookings, I quote, "While there are exceptions, most notably South Africa and several resource-rich or fragile states, the economic growth registered since 2000 was accompanied by a steady growth in wage jobs at a rate significantly faster than the growth of the labor force. Meanwhile, youth unemployment has been below world averages, controlling for income level. Unfortunately, this process was interrupted by the COVID-19 health and economic crisis, but it demonstrates the importance for job creation in African countries of getting back onto the path of economic stability and balanced economic growth, as well as maintaining this trajectory through this decade," end of quote. Diaspora power. One of Africa's biggest assets is its global diaspora, created in successive waves of dispersal from the continent following the emergence of the modern world system. As the late renowned Egyptian intellectual Samir Amin often reminded us, Africans and Africa played a pivotal role in the development of the modern world system, notwithstanding their exploitation and subjugation. Being oppressed doesn't mean being marginal. As we know, the oppression of women and workers doesn't entail their irrelevance to the intersected system of racialized and patriarchal capitalism. Diaspora Africans from the Iberian Peninsula were among the conquerors of the Americas, and enslaved people from Western Africa, whose numbers outstripped European migrations until the staggered abolitions of the slave trade and slavery, helped lay the demographic, economic, social, cultural, and political foundations of the emerging colonial settler societies. As Walter Rodney taught us 50 years ago in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, that became the canonical text of my generation as college students, slavery profoundly defined the development of modern capitalism. its institutional arrangements, and intellectual and ideological scaffolding. Rodney's powerful thesis echoed age-old writings by political activists and public intellectuals across the diaspora. In the United States, they range from Frederick Douglass to Ida B. Wells to W.E.B. Du Bois to Mary McLeod Bethune. In his magisterial 2021 book, Out of Africa, The Real Roots of the Modern World, Howard French boldly takes the mantle of retrieving Africa from the mute presence and marginality imposed by Eurocentrism's enduring epistemic conceits. Compellingly, he illuminates Africa's centrality in the birth of the modern world. Once academic discourses enter the popular media, they are deployed by dueling partisans and pundits. And so it was with the 1619 Project of the New York Times that repackaged well-known academic analysis that put enslaved Africans and their descendants at the center of American history, society, and culture, and the development of the country's economic, political, judicial, and educational institutions, as well as the struggles in the fiercely contested and unfinished project of democracy. The series inflamed America's already incendiary racial politics, followed by the global racial reckoning forced by the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. Recentering the histories of Africa's old diasporas is essential for repositioning the centrality of Africa in world history and its multiple futures. There are nearly 200 million of them, the largest being in Brazil with approximately 97 million, the United States with 43 million, and the Caribbean with 28 million. The new diasporas created out of Africa's recent global migrations number more than 15 million. In 2020, Africa had 40.6 million immigrants, representing 14.5% of the world's total of 280.6 million. The respective percentages were highest for Asia, 40.9%, Europe, 22.6%, the Americas, 16.8%, and Oceania, 1.1%. 25 million of the continent's international immigrants lived on the continent itself, representing 1.9% of the total African population. Globally, immigrants represented 3.6% of the world's population from 2.8%. So when you hear all these stories about migrants conquering, flooding countries, it's not true. Most people live in the countries they were born. For the past 2 decades, I have been investigating the complex patterns and processes of engagement between Africa and its diasporas in Afro-America, Afro-Europe, and Afro-Asia. In my work, I focus on 6 sets of flows: demographic, cultural, economic, political, ideological, and iconographic. Particularly well-known is the important role played by the historic diaspora in the development of Pan-Africanism and the process of decolonization, which reverberated with civil rights struggles in the diaspora. Equally fascinating are the intricate cultural and artistic exchanges from religion to the performing and visual arts that I'll briefly discuss shortly. The new diasporas are enmeshed in complex and contradictory relations with the historic diaspora and Africa itself, encompassing physical movements, exchanges of cultural practices, productive resources, organizations and movements, ideologies and ideas, images and representations. The new diaspora is Africa's biggest donor, to use the language of the development industry. Not China, not the United States, not the EU. In 2019, before the COVID-19 pandemic, remittances from the new diaspora to Africa reached $84.3 billion. They represented between 8.8% of GDP for Egypt, which received $26.4 billion, the largest, and 9.9% of GDP for Kenya, that garnered $2.9 billion. The opportunities for the remittances of social capital, including what I call intellectual remittances, are immense. For example, there are approximately 2.1 million immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa in the United States, to quote a report by the Immigration Policy Institute, quote, tend to have higher levels of education than the overall foreign and native-born populations. In 2019, 42% of sub-Saharan Africans ages 25 and over held a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 33% for both all foreign and US-born adults, end of quote. Relations between Africa and its global diasporas, old and new, must be scaffolded to a Pan-Africanism of the 21st century that simultaneously looks back and forward. The first requires critically examining the diverse and complicated histories of Pan-Africanisms, and I'll use that plural deliberately, in their ideological, political, economic, cultural, social, and artistic articulations across the interconnected local, national, regional, continental, transcontinental, and global historical geographies, paying attention to the work, struggles, activities, imaginations, and aspirations of elites and ordinary people, men and women, and young and old. The second entails locating Pan-Africanism in the maelstrom of the contemporary world and its difficult demands and tantalizing possibilities. We need to decipher systematically, strategically, and smartly what the political economies and ecologies of the 21st century entail for African peoples around the world. Finally, cultural capital. In a world obsessed with the materialities and imperatives of economic growth and development, it is easy to underestimate the centrality of cultural production and consumption, how the cultural and artistic artifacts of the human imagination embody and endow us with profound ontological and epistemological meanings. African cultural economies need to be understood from historical, expansive, and open-ended epistemic, aesthetic, and social political processes. Under the authoritarian gaze and logic of empire, sanctified by the primitivist fantasies and desires of colonial anthropology, the authenticity of African cultures was frozen in an ethnographic present and premised on eternal difference and inferiority to Europe. African tradition interpolated as an external African past was counterposed to a dynamic Western modernity. The former purportedly represented the real Africa, and the latter imported mimicry. In reality, during the colonial encounter, African cultures were produced and reproduced through the dialectical interplay of domination, resistance, and conversion, in which imperial ideologies, practices, and spectacles, and colonial transactions, negotiations, and struggles clashed and coalesced in messy and predictable and tumultuous ways as historical processes tend to. The metropoles and colonies became imbricated, although each valorized the representations of difference in stressing, reproducing, and performing their respective ontological distinctions, despite the fact that the social formations of both were being reconfigured. This points to the inherent complexity in the project of cultural decolonization. Colonialism and globalization make the recuperation of pre-colonial African cultures, which were themselves neither static nor uniform, idealistic gestures at best. Unpacking the historical processes of colonial cultural production is exceedingly demanding, but critical to theorizing Africa's cultural transformation. Part of the challenge is that during the colonial period and after, cultures on the continent were also influenced by diaspora cultures and vice versa. In a paper on musical engagements, for example, I show that, quote, the influence of diasporan music on modern African music, especially popular music, has been immense. These influences and exchanges have created a complex tapestry of musical Afro-internationalism and Afro-modernism, and music has been a critical site, a soundscape, in the construction of new diasporan and African identities. A diasporic perspective in the study of modern African music helps Africa reclaim its rightful place in the history of world music and saves Africans from unnecessary cultural anxieties about losing their musical authenticity by borrowing from Western music that appears on closer inspection to be diasporan African music, end of quote. The creative arts have constituted critical media of communication in the Pan-African world, through which cultural influences, ideas, images, instruments, institutions, and identities have continually circulated in the process, creating new modes of cultural expression. in both spaces. This traffic in expressive culture is multi-dimensional and dynamic. It is facilitated by persistent demographic flows and ever-changing communication technologies, and involves exchanges that are simultaneously transcontinental, transnational, and translational of artistic products, aesthetic codes, and conceptual matrices. We have to go beyond the depoliticized, dehistoricized, idealistic, and technicist approaches that treat African cultures within the continent and in the diaspora as separate from each other and divorced from political economy, and by reducing and equating African culture to tradition and imagined pre-colonial pasts. The versatility and irrepressible exuberance of popular African cultures and creative arts, their irreverent and exhilarating yearnings for all-inclusive liberation, mocks and subverts the singular elite narratives of African nationalism, their aspirations for social uniformity and conformity. The importance of African cultural creative industries, CCI, is increasingly recognized by governments, the corporate sector, social movements, and among the creative communities themselves, within Africa, the diaspora, and around the world. Some value CCIs for their economic contributions to development. Others stress their dynamism and demonstrative power of African energies, excellence, and empowerment. There are also those who applaud them for their capacity to forge shared Pan-African identities, understanding, and committee. The African CCIs are, of course, not new, although the discourse is. It brings together earlier debates sponsored by UNESCO and the Organization of African Unity about culture and development, and deliberations on the culture industry and later creative industry in the global north, which continues to dominate theorization of the concept. In 2008, the African Union adopted a plan of action on cultural and creative industries. It applauded, quote, the significant increase in the share of culture, information, and the services sectors of the world market, end of quote, due to the liberalization of political systems and industries as part of globalization and increasing youth populations. A year later, in 2009, UNESCO published a new framework for cultural statistics to better capture the sector's breadth and depth, develop direct metrics measuring its economic and social dimensions, facilitate international comparative assessment, and integrate conceptual debates and new developments. It divided the cultural economy into 6 categories. First, cultural domains, encompassing several practices and products. Second, intangible cultural heritage, comprising oral traditions and expressions, ritual languages and social practices. Third, education and training. Fourth, archiving and preserving. Fifth, equipment and supporting materials. And finally, the related domains of tourism and sports and recreation. The growth of cultural industries in Africa is quite impressive. One consultancy report enthuses, I quote, emerging markets, particularly those in Africa, are home to vibrant creative and cultural industries with massive investment potential. From the Yoruba to the Congo, African civilizations have shaped the aesthetics, music, sculpture, textiles, and architecture of regions from North America to Latin America and Europe for centuries, end of quote. The vibrancy and potential of the CCI is attributed to the continent's rapid urbanization, explosion in the youth population, expanding middle classes, and increased internet and mobile penetration. African artists are effectively using digital technologies to produce their work, access and expand their audiences, and dialogue with them. The consumption of music through streaming services has grown, and the COVID-19 pandemic made virtual concerts and performances vital for survival. Similarly, digital technology has revolutionized the African film industry as the consumption of films expand through on-demand streaming services, smartphones, the internet, and television. African films are increasingly distributed through such domestic platforms as Iroko from Nigeria, Showmax from South Africa, Viusasa from Kenya, that were created in the 2010s. And of course, international platforms, including Netflix and Amazon Prime. African fashion has also experienced remarkable growth, and local designers are increasingly patronized by the expanding middle classes keen to wear their national pride on their sleeves. African fashion shows are now common in major African and world capitals. E-commerce has expanded the regional, diaspora, and global reach of some fashion brands. Thus, the appeal of the African CCIs goes beyond Africa. There is a huge market in the diaspora, both new and historic. I see some of you wearing those clothes, to perform and consume diaspora identities. African cultural producers are increasingly subject to the push and pull of local and global appeal. The former matters for them in signifying their African authenticity and in generating revenues and driving their international influence that can be even more lucrative. The rising attractiveness of African creative products to consumers in the global north and some regions of the global south, other than the diaspora, is premised in part on the prior domestic popularity. The power of the diaspora, especially African Americans, as trendsetters of popular culture, the expansion of global tourism to Africa before COVID-19, and the proliferation of social media. Moreover, there is a long history of Western artists, Picasso being one of the most well-known in the 20th century, mining, borrowing, and exploiting African cultures and arts for inspiration and novelty, for new styles, motifs, and expressive languages. More recently, major Western entertainment firms are expanding their corporate footprint in Africa, especially in music. In the contemporary global conjuncture, there can be little doubt that culture and economy are interconnected. The challenge for Africa's cultural economies is to develop paradigms and practices in which culture is a site of resistance and radical dreams and visions of a different future, rather than being relegated to one more raw material to be exported from Africa. Africa's cultural economies must simultaneously pursue the enduring struggles for decolonization, as well as the reconfiguration of the creative arts and cultures and their expressive and performative ethos, motifs, aesthetics that unapologetically reflect African and diaspora modernities. It must help us reimagine ways of being whole, of knowing, seeing, and fully living in the contemporary world, of seizing and possessing the 21st century as truly ours, to paraphrase and realize Kwame Nkrumah's long-deferred dream for the 20th century. The power of the creative arts goes beyond its economic and social value. It is fundamental to people's identities, their emotional and mental health, and ultimately, their humanity. In conclusion, Africa's demographic, diaspora, and cultural resurgence, together with equally complex and contradictory transformations in various political, economic, social, and ecological spheres that I have not examined in this presentation, have far-reaching implications for the world. Africa has never been a peripheral region, and certainly what happens on the continent will shape the rest of the world in this and subsequent centuries. This is a reality the major emerging economies, including China, are increasingly embracing. The United States is behind the curve. Its Africa policy locked in outdated humanitarian and security impasses, increasingly overlaid by re-emerging Cold War imperatives. Take trade, for example. In 2021, while trade between China and Africa reached $254 billion, for the United States, it declined to $64 billion from $142 billion in 2008. Chinese investments also eclipse America's, as the latter clings to what I call the necrophilia of dead aid, as Dambisa Moyo calls it in her controversial book. In an article published 2 days ago that I was reading at lunch in Foreign Affairs, titled The Unkept Promises of Western Aid by Ian Mitchell and Nancy Birdsall, state, quote, in truth, wealthy Western donor countries are not always honest about the remittances they provide. They find ways to exaggerate their real commitments through creative and dubious accounting practices meant to expand the definition of development aid spending. And when it comes to the other category of assistance that wealthy countries owe to developing ones, finance to help the Global South mitigate and adapt to climate change, rich countries fall egregiously short of what they have pledged, which is in turn tragically short of what poorer ones need, end of quote. Any productive American engagement with Africa requires, argues John Temin, again in Foreign Affairs, it requires reframing Africa geographically by abandoning the Eurocentric division of sub-Saharan and North Africa, supporting strong institutions over individual leaders, repudiating, I quote, the narrative that it is battling China for primacy in Africa, end of quote, and embracing African voices in international forums and geopolitical interests by reforming the United Nations Security Council and the architecture of international financial institutions. Ignorance or disregard of African geopolitical interests will not serve any global power well, as its ill-informed pressures will be met by African resentment and resistance. Current American diplomatic pressure on African countries over Ukraine, including a proposed law in Congress that only targets the African region to toe the Western line, is deeply problematic and will not succeed. As Nanjala Nyabola reminds us, again in Foreign Affairs, and I quote, for many Africans, the current overtures from both Russia and the West are not about friendship. They are about using Africa as a means to an end. The dominant African position, given the large uncertainties about the war and its outcome, has been to demand peace and urge diplomacy, and whenever possible, to avoid having to take sides in a conflict that seems unlikely to offer much to Africa, particularly if it turns the continent into a new theater of proxy war, end of quote. What does this all mean for higher education institutions in the global north? In a recent presentation on rethinking global higher education partnerships, I propose a 12-pronged agenda. Time, obviously, does not allow me to say what this means, except to point out that fundamentally it entails epistemic diversity, humility, and inclusion of African knowledges by institutions in the global north, and forging productive partnerships premised on the ethical principles of respect, co-creation, and mutuality of benefits. Since modern humans emerged in Africa 300,000 years ago, from where they spread to other continents 65 to 50,000 years ago, the long arc of history has bent towards two inexorable forces of globality, which override the periodic ruptures of great wars and the moral panics of othering outsiders. One is the expanding cycle of spatio-temporal compression that intensifies connectedness, communication, and the circulation of people, plants, and pathogens, cultures, commodities, and capital, ideas, ideologies, and institutions. The other is the rise and fall of civilizations, the periodic shifts in the geographies and technologies of hegemony and domination that the world is currently undergoing. Ali Mazrui ended his celebrated television series, The Africans, A Triple Heritage, with an intriguing paean, quote, "We are the people of the day before yesterday, and the people of the day after tomorrow," end of quote. I read this as a tribute to the ancestral primacy of Africa and its assured presence in the world's futures as a player, not the pawn it has been over the last few centuries. The historic and humanistic project of fashioning African futures entails retrieving the past and reconstructing the present and investing our imaginations and energies in imagining a world that valorizes our duality as social beings and ecological beings, living in harmony with each other and sustainably with nature. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Zeleza, for, I knew it was going to be really good. That was truly, truly amazing. Thank you so much. You have given us so much to think about, and you've given a call to action. I believe that in Pittsburgh and at the University of Pittsburgh, we are going to take your call to heart and act upon it. And I invite all of you to join in this work.